You're listening to episode 306 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Cameron Conaway joins us to speak about how Buddhist practice has helped the healing process of childhood trauma. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. If you have a history of childhood trauma of some kind, know that in today's episode we explore this topic from the inside. Our guest openly discusses the pain he's endured, how it influenced his life, and how the wisdom of Thich Nhat Hanh has helped move his heart closer to peace. Cameron Conaway is the Director of Marketing Communications at Solace and the author of Caged, Memoirs of a Cage-Fighting Poet, and Manbox, Poems, along with other volumes. He is a recipient of the 2016 Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative Fellowship, an honor given to one journalist each year, and his work has appeared in publications such as Newsweek, ESPN, The Guardian, Reuters, NPR, Forbes, The Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, and Stanford Social Innovation Review, among others. Cameron has received grants from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and the International Reporting Project, nominations for a National Magazine Award and a Pushcart Prize, and writing residencies from Penn State University, the Wellcome Trust, and the University of Arizona. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice camellia tea. Our guest today is Cameron Conaway. Cameron, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Ted. Appreciate it.
Yeah, really read with great interest an article that was recently published in Lion's Roar, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but why don't we start by having you say a bit about your background?
Sure. I really started at the boxing club in Altoona, Pennsylvania when I was 12 or 13. That's where I think my first identity started to form. My father left our lives around that point, and I was searching for a father figure. And through the boxing club, through the mentors that I made there, through the lessons of, in many ways, physical punishment that taught me some positive things about how to kind of find the grit to get through difficult moments. That journey continued until I turned professional as a mixed martial artist when I was around 20, 21 or so. On the way, however, I fell in love with poetry. And so studied that at Penn State University. I was reading Mary Oliver and Gary Snyder and even Bruce Lee. Put water into a teacup and it becomes the teacup. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be like water, my friend. And I was physically training 8 to 10 hours a day. But I thought to myself, I cannot think at that level. And so I wonder if I will be a better martial artist if I study poetry. And so I took an introduction to poetry class, and my first teacher was, her name's Lee Peterson, and she wrote a book about the war in Bosnia. And up until that point, mostly I thought poetry was A B, sing song. And here she is tackling really important social issues. So I was very inspired by her and her work. Then my next mentor in college was a poet named Todd Davis, one of the premier nature poets in the country. And so he again exposed us to many Zen poets, and kind of allowed me to see that. And he was a D1 basketball player, so allowed me to see that I could bridge both of those worlds of athlete and poet, and also Zen practitioner and meditator. That could be rolled in there as well. So that's been my journey. From there, I was a journalist for 10, 11 years. Had several years in Asia where I covered the sex trafficking of boys. Kind of leads us to where we are today.
And I also want to note that I'll be including a link on the webpage for this episode that you have published your own book of poems. And I wonder if you could say just a little bit about that too.
Sure. So yeah, I have six books out in the world. 2014, I published a book called Malaria Poems. And that was a result of about a year of research. I studied with a lot of malariologists in Thailand and throughout the world, trying to kind of humanize the stories behind malaria, because so much of the conversation was science driven and data driven and missing the very real human impact of malaria. So yeah, I tried to put a book together about that. The only real malaria poet prior to them was Dr. Seuss, who was asked to write nature poetry for the military many years ago to educate the troops. And so I thought, we need a deeper analysis of this. So I'm going to go for it. And then my latest book that came out a few weeks ago is called Man Box. So it's trying to address issues of toxic masculinity and how that manifests in society.
So let's delve into this a bit. Your article in Lion's Roar, and what led you into that path that you
Sure. Yeah. So the root of starting at the boxing club when I was 12, in many ways that grew from anger. I was a small boy abused by my father, and also watching my younger sister, who was 8 or 9 at the time, abused by my father, and feeling entirely helpless. And I was an undersized point guard at that point. So not only was I 12, but I was tiny, 70 pounds, probably soaking wet. So yeah, studying boxing, studying mixed martial arts kind of gave me that confidence to feel like I could get to a point where I could protect myself. Over time, however, though, I found that it was really a mask. I was masking my feelings. Every time I hit the heavy bag, I was hitting my father. And even when I turned pro when I was 20, there's a clip that's on YouTube. It's probably will live indefinitely. But I won my fight, and I stood up and I start screaming a bunch of profanities. And when I look back at that tape, I realized I was actually screaming at my father, who I hadn't seen in 10 years. I wasn't screaming about my own success. I wasn't thanking my mother. I was screaming, "I told you so. I told you so," to a man that I hadn't seen in over 10 years. That to me was really a big moment, the recognition of that. Again, I continued along the path of training. And really, it wasn't until a meditation retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh in Thailand where I think I had my biggest moment of healing along this kind of journey of suffering that I had. And writing for me is the most disciplined form of thinking. But I had always entered that lens through nonfiction, where it's kind of like a cow's stomach. You regurgitate and you see it again, and then you bring it back up, and you get to deeper truths, right? But Thai led us through this guided meditation where we were asked to see our father as a young child beside us playing in a stream. And this meditation was about an hour, Ted, and he walked us through, and it was just really me and my dad, both as very young children, playing in a stream, throwing rocks back and forth, having fun. And something about that made me realize he has a little boy in him as well. And so much of the suffering that he caused is because of the suffering that he endured from his father. But at his root, he had the same naivety. He had the same vulnerabilities, the same playfulness as I did. We were complete equals during that hour meditation. And Thai guided us through it. I didn't realize it at the point because I was I was visualizing it so much, but I was bawling. There were tears coming down my face. And Ty put his hand on my shoulder and, said, when you stand up, just stand up as though you're kissing the floor. And it's hard to describe how much that really put me on a new path of healing. And I think part of it is he allowed us to take those imaginative leaps. He allowed us to find sometimes the deeper truths that occur in fiction, right? That I hadn't explored it to that point because I just kept trying to drill in on the memories of my own nonfiction truth.
And I imagine one of the difficulties with that moment is not simply the recognition that someone who has harmed you so very much, you and your sisters, so very deeply for years, even years after the actual actions had occurred, there was still this harm. There's the recognition of them as a harmed child, as an innocent as well. So one of the difficulties I can imagine would be the holding of both of those, that it doesn't dismiss the harm that was done, because that's still there, and acknowledging that there is another side to this as well. So what's that been like for you? Because that's a deep territory for exploration too.
It was. And I had heard stories about what his father put him through. But up until then, I didn't feel that I had the courage to associate those stories with my father's identity. I kind of separated the two. I almost didn't want a full picture of my father. I wanted this very limited picture that I knew. And it was when I realized he's a complex being like me and was in many situations like me that, I had a fuller picture that allowed me to understand who he was, the decisions that he made. And it actually, after the retreat, I reached out to him for the first time in a long time. And so we had about an hour-long conversation. And he apologized at the beginning of the conversation, and we had a few emotional moments there. But the next 40 minutes of that conversation were essentially stories of bragging about harming others. I kind of listened to his stories about that, and just made me realize that I was happy that I reached out. We had that those first few 20 minutes of connection and apologizing and understanding, but that it wasn't a person that I wanted to have in my circle.
Yeah.
And for me, that was healing as well, right? Because I had always wondered.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring this up, because the formation of what I would call appropriate boundaries is not a wrong thing. That's come up recently in our in-person community sit that I lead at the Center for Mindfulness just this past week, actually past Monday, as of this recording, where there was some sharing, which I actually started in my own history, and that led to other individuals sharing. And they had to temper it's not all about forgiving and forgetting everything. That's not what we're doing here. That it is appropriate for you to not forget, forgive, and that you're not carrying weight of burdening yourself with the actions of other people's shenanigans, as is said at tea time at Birken Forest Monastery, that you form appropriate boundaries. And sometimes those boundaries do mean an appropriate and safe distance.
Yeah.
So what was that realization like for you, and how was that played out since then?
Yeah. So for me, I think when I left the retreat, I had this idea that whatever struggle that I faced in my life or that may come up, I wanted to default to open. I wanted to make my default to open. For me, what that means was I had to go call my father, right? But I also think I thought it meant that I had to have a new relationship with him. I had to make open how I live my life. But really, making your default to open doesn't mean you can't form those appropriate boundaries, right? There are perfectly acceptable reasons to default to open, but then close a few doors along the way as you do. So that's kind of the lesson I think that I continue to live out now. If I'm entering a creative tension at work, in my own work, something triggers a memory, I default to open to it and try to give my whole self to it, try to see the complexity of it and all its beauty, and then realize, if that's going to benefit my life or not, and if I need to close that door or not.
So I'm curious, over the intervening years since 2013, and you were on retreat and had this breakthrough, It's been a few years. I'm curious about how this is manifested both in your practice, your formal practice, and in your daily life. How have
Yeah,
things been
great.
percolating and showing
Yeah.
up?
Yeah, I have felt happier than ever, I'll say. And it's tough. It's a tough thing to measure, but I have felt like I'm holding on to less. My wife and I have moved 6, 7 times within that 5 year period. She's been on her own journey of she's had 9 knee surgeries across 15 years, so she's had a really difficult time with that. We have learned from John Kabat-Zinn and MBSR. I attended a retreat at the Blue Cliff Monastery in New York. So again, kind of building that community here. And we just moved to San Francisco last year, so we're starting to kind of build that community here as well. So I think we've realized the importance of personal growth through personal introspection, but also the impact of community.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had that moment with Ty if it wasn't for all the people around me as well that were supportive and created that psychological safety that I needed to feel comfortable enough to cry. If it was just me and Ty in a room, I don't know if that would have happened. It was the community that Ty formed, right? So yeah, I think that's been more important than ever for us, and we're trying to develop that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And as we maintain our awareness of Buddhist views on the importance of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, that this community aspect, which is sometimes very difficult for people like me, I'm an introvert, I'm not comfortable in crowds. Community is a really difficult concept. And part of this is the complexity of social interactions when they can be very difficult for some of us to navigate. One-on-one is great. More than that, wow, that's too much.
Uh-huh.
And also, history of trauma can sometimes make these difficult. So it can be really difficult to navigate those waters. And I'm wondering if you've run into that yourself in just establishing connection and community, or has that come fairly easily to you?
No, fellow introvert here, and and I'm part of the executive MBA program at University of San Francisco. So we've done all these incredible personality attribute studies, and we did the Hogan assessment, right? And the end result is that I default to being an introvert, and I would much rather be in a library cubicle writing and thinking, right?
Yep.
But we've had so many exercises in class where I've seen the collective brilliance that can come and that can arise from team-based activities. And there's just simply no way to recreate that in your head. There is a very clear benefit for how us humans, epigenetically and otherwise, have evolved over the years. And it is as teams collaborating on things. However, after 3 days of that in the MBA program, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
Right? That's energy that I have to, it's not natural. I don't default to extrovertism. And so I get home and I sleep for like 10 hours after those 3 day sessions. But I find the value in it too. And I think, again, my default was I would go weeks without really seeing a community or being part of a community or contributing to that. And now I'm kind of like, I need more of a balance. So yeah.
Right. And I like the way you characterized it as there is value in this. And I think in part comes from the sense of welcome to whatever is present that I see in our own communities and various communities I've been honored to be part of, that tears are welcome. Laughter is welcome. The full breadth of human experience is welcome. And that itself fosters the sharing and potentially that release and that insight to what can be learned from that.
And Ted, I don't know if you're seeing it, but I am feeling this movement toward openness and toward authenticity. Authenticity in many ways is becoming a buzzword in the business world. Right. But I am actually seeing very positive, real representations of it. Mm-hmm. And that to me is incredibly exciting, where colleagues that may only have been able to talk about work now feel comfortable talking about what they're struggling with outside of work. And it's just creating much more healthy workplaces in some settings, obviously not across the board. But to me, that's a really beautiful awakening, that some of the lessons of secular Buddhism are kind of spilling outside of the realms of Buddhism itself and into the workplace and into the family life. And we had some amazing exercises in the MBA program of just sharing our full selves. I think half the class was crying at each other's stories and coming together, and just the importance of listening as well. And so I'm seeing a kind of energy that's making me really happy how we are starting to evolve in that sense. So
Yeah, it's interesting how when I will start an exercise where people will either will be doing partner work or some other stuff, group sharing, and I just say to kind of warm people up to this concept. And these are people who've heard this from me almost on a weekly basis.
right.
And I will say, think about the last time you were really listened to, not just heard, but really listened to, and noticing what that was like. And for newcomers, I'll see some, nodding heads like, oh yeah, or then I'll offer the opposite side of that, or maybe think of a time where you really needed to be heard and weren't, and what was that like? And so here we're going to give that wonderful gift of listening, and how that's very much an active role in something that you're giving to a speaker.
Yeah, I like that you framed it there as a gift. I think I've heard Ty say that quite a bit as well. That the greatest gift we can give each other is our presence, our listening. And I think we've all been in those conflicts where we have said it out loud, or at least felt it. You're not listening to me.
Right.
You're hearing the words, but not listening to me, and it hurts. Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about really two things. First is just how your own way of being, maybe your career aspirations and what you do, have shifted. What is it that you're seeing that you like? You've already mentioned there seems to be an undercurrent of openness that's occurring in the world. I agree. I'm seeing that as well, at least in certain circles, the ones we're in. But I'm wondering what else it is that you're seeing, maybe in your personal life or out in the world. And then what would you like to see that you're not seeing enough of?
Great question. So first part of that is this idea of slowing down to wake up. There are, and I've moved from journalism into marketing, and understand that so many of the social platforms that probably this podcast will be shared on have been engineered by some of the smartest people in the world to steal our attention away and to continue getting us to scroll and to almost become a new addiction for us.
Which they are now regretting as they have their children. I've seen several of these folks you're referring to speaking at conferences recently saying, I'm now understanding the harm that we've caused by doing that.
And so I think that's part of the shift that I mentioned earlier. We're seeing companies like Asana come out and have implicit bias training and have meditation training as part of what they're doing in the workplace. So that's kind of cool. But I think, for me, it's been that real need to slow down. I was an adjunct professor for a few years, trying to write books. I was pitching The Guardian and Newsweek and articles I was trying to write. I mean, it was a very, very real hustle, 12, 14-hour days, that kind of thing. And, I realized that I actually made better, smarter decisions when I just carved out an hour and I stopped working. and I just let ideas percolate. And there's a lot of research coming out of Wharton and Professor Adam Grant there that's saying, like, once you have an idea, if you just kind of let it sit for a while, I think he called it intentional procrastination or something like that. Just this idea of letting go and kind of letting the idea do its thing without you forcing it to do so can create some new awakenings. So that's been one positive. The shift that I would like to see has to do with, and I think this is what hurts me most about our society, is this the ease with which we allow our fears, whether they are manufactured fears by politicians or otherwise, lump us into a tribalistic mindset and into a team-based culture where we refuse to see the side of any other team.
Right.
Whether it's a political party, it's our religious affiliation. This idea that we are right, and whoever flings dogma the loudest and the hardest wins.
Yeah.
That terrifies me, honestly.
Yeah.
So I don't know the collective solution there, but I think carving out spaces for conversations and listening is probably the only way that we can start to make progress there, and bringing disparate teams, disparate ideas together, and having diverse teams is one way to break through that. But I would actually love to hear your thoughts on that. That this kind of tribalism that I'm seeing is yeah, it's painful, and I don't know that I'm seeing a progression against it as fast as I would like. And maybe that's
Right.
my own impatience, but yeah, would love your thoughts there.
I'm seeing the same thing, that a growth of the tribalistic attitudes of us versus them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is being fueled by those who have a high profile. We'll leave it at that, with that
Sure.
description. And I think one of the things that helps offset that is really a couple of things. And some of those I think are fairly easy. And it's those with high profiles themselves who have a counter view to model the behavior that we want to see in the world. I think that's extremely important, is to see that it can be done, not just say, do this, but show how it is. That's much more important than simply giving someone the answer, because that settles in on your forehead and has a little bit harder time sinking into the rest of your being when you're just given the answer.
So it needs to be modeled. And you see this kind of as a function of leadership, as a leader modeling this and showing that there's an alternative.
Yeah, and understanding that that's one aspect, those who are in high profile positions. But I really love that you brought up this concept of leadership. I was just at the Mindful Leaders Conference in DC, and one of the things that became very clear for me there, and it's being clear, so this is a refreshing, is that leadership is not just for those who are well-known, those who may be in decision-making roles. It's anyone and everyone is a leader, and we lead by how we are in the world. So that's a choice. It's not always a choice that we make consciously or unconsciously. We're always showing something. We're always communicating something. So what is it that that's going to be? So that's one of the important aspects, is modeling the behavior we want to see. If it's not tribalism, then how do we model something else? How do we model coming together with curiosity, with genuine interest, with care? Another thing, and I think this is much more difficult, is not to let our fears be the only thing that leads us, but also have, as you have done, is setting appropriate boundaries. So suggesting that, for example, I've heard discussions where those who are allies, say to issues of diversity, who are nonetheless silent or not willing to speak out against discrimination, or in other topics, those who are not willing to speak out against theft or any other kinds of wrongs or abuse of others, whatever it happens to be, it is appropriate to stand up and say, no, this is not okay. And have those boundaries. Those aren't always just boundaries of insulation from the bad.
Yes.
It's also boundaries of, no, this is the boundaries around society, around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So those boundaries are not just keep everything out. It's also welcoming in, and also drawing lines about, no, this is not okay, and this needs to change. And that part in particular is the hardest.
Yeah.
Because it's knowing when to say, no, you who are espousing a particular view that I find harmful, I also need to have an out for you to change your mind, as some do. But I also need to recognize that that's on you.
Yes.
And that path is there, but we can't walk it for you. And to say, in the meantime, you have work to do. And what is the best way? And I think this is where really the rich part of the conversation comes in for any of us doing this work, is what is it that can elicit that change? What is it that it can elicit that awareness of, oh, this is why it's bad for me to do this.
Yeah.
That's
I think these type of conversations, I think, that we're having now are really important, because, as you know, we can sit in front of our computers as individuals and create bubbles of the type of content that we want to see. Right. And in my eyes, it is a literary diet. We can choose certain sources out there, and that becomes our truth. And then we move out into the world where we're interacting with people kind of still in that bubble. And we only want to associate with other people that can kind of morph into that bubble with us.
Right.
And so, I see the role of media and content really needing to change as well. There has to be a transformation in how local journalism organizations are supported. There are so many incredible investigative journalists coming out of J School that end up having to go and work for advertising agencies, right? Because they cannot find a job either at their local news station or at places like Reuters, right? That are winning Pulitzer Prizes covering the genocide in Burma, for instance. So I think when we have some of our best journalists and best storytellers unable to speak their truths and use their talents, it harms society. It really harms our democracy. Many shifts have to happen, I think, but we're starting to.
We'll never be bored. I'll put it that way.
Yes, we have work to do.
Yeah. Cameron, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you might say to the listeners, and perhaps particularly those who might be dealing with trauma, either something they're well aware of and have been working with, or maybe it's something that they haven't really wrestled with yet. What might you say to them?
That's great. I think what has helped me, and I've been on so many speaking circuits at universities, and what seems to have helped so many other students is to just realize you are not alone in what you're feeling. Your situation is entirely unique, but there are so many people out there who are ready to listen, who have had similar experiences, who are also wrestling with that, and who also kind of need a sense of community and want to help you and help themselves as well. And so, I would say if you're wrestling with something really difficult, it's important to find that sense of community in your community, in online forums, with family members that maybe you haven't talked to at such deep levels. I would say that's what I would advise. Yeah.
Nicely said. Well, our guest today, Cameron Conaway. For those of you who are interested, I'll be linking to his LinkedIn and to the article that you mentioned that was in the Lion's Roar, along with several of Cameron's books. Cameron, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Ted. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.